Tonight, we are not chasing every rumor that ever attached itself to MH370. We are following the strongest documented trail because this case is frightening enough without adding fiction. In a world of radar, satellites, flight plans, and constant tracking, one passenger jet still vanished. That alone is disturbing. What makes this story even darker is that the plane did not simply disappear from history. It left fragments, signals, course changes, and questions that never fully stopped. And when you line those pieces up in the right order, the mystery becomes less like a ghost story and more like a file with one final page torn out. That is where we begin. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, a Boeing 777, was flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, with 227 passengers and 12 crew on board. Then, during that journey, it was lost. More than a decade later, the wreckage still has not been fully recovered, and that is why MH370 remains one of aviation's most enduring unsolved cases. At first, this looked like the kind of event modern systems should be able to explain. A commercial aircraft leaves one city, heads toward another, and follows a known route through monitored airspace. There should be a timeline. There should be a chain of contact. There should be a point where the story becomes clear. Instead, the record breaks in a way that still feels almost impossible. The ordinary rhythm of a scheduled flight gave way to silence. And that silence created the first dangerous illusion in this story. The belief that the aircraft had simply vanished along its expected path. That assumption shaped the earliest search effort. It was also wrong. The first searches focused on the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca. That made sense only if the aircraft had continued normally. But later analysis changed everything. According to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the picture shifted when analysis showed the aircraft did not continue north as expected, and instead turned south toward the southern Indian Ocean. That single change did not just move a line on a map. It transformed the entire meaning of the case. Because once the road is no longer a straight continuation, this stops feeling like a simple loss of contact and starts looking like a diversion. That is the first major reason people stay trapped in this story. The plane did not only go missing. The trail suggests that it went somewhere else. And from that point on, every new detail feels less like closure and more like a deeper layer. A missing aircraft is one kind of mystery. An aircraft that appears to have changed its path before disappearing is something far more unsettling. Now the question is not only where it ended. The question becomes why it stopped being where it was supposed to be at all. Then comes the second turning point. And this is the detail that gives the case its strange modern shape. Even after the aircraft dropped out of the normal picture, the search was later guided by data from automatic connections between the plane and an Inmarsat satellite. Those automatic satellite handshakes did not tell investigators everything. They did not reveal a cockpit conversation. They did not identify a motive. They did not tell the world exactly what happened inside the cabin. But they did something crucial. They pushed the search away from the early assumptions and toward the southern Indian Ocean. In other words, the aircraft became invisible in one system, while still leaving a faint trace in another. That is one of the most unnerving parts of the entire file. MH370 did not vanish cleanly. It left just enough behind to point somewhere, but not enough to settle the case. Once the probable search zone moved, the scale of the hunt became enormous. This was not a small private search for a lost object. This became one of the largest and most difficult searches in aviation history. The ATSB says that between May 2014 and January 2017, it led an underwater search, and that search covered more than 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor in the southern Indian Ocean. That is not only vast, It is brutally remote, exposed to harsh conditions and far from port. Hundreds of people worked on it. Ships, aircraft, mapping systems, deep-sea technology, and years of effort were poured into the operation. And still, the aircraft was not found. The search was suspended in January 2017. Then, in 2018, Ocean Infinity carried out another no-find, no-fee search. And that effort also failed to locate the missing aircraft. A mystery feels different after that. Once so much time, money, and expertise had already gone into finding something, every failure stopped sounding temporary and started feeling like a warning. But this is not a story of total emptiness. That matters. Because saying nothing was ever found is not true. Over time, debris linked to MH370 entered the story. Reuters reported that debris, some confirmed and some believed to be from the aircraft, washed up along the coast of Africa and on islands in the Indian Ocean. The ATSB also states that it examined several pieces of aircraft debris, including a section of the right outboard wing flap. So the case did not disappear into a complete void. It left physical traces. That changes the emotional shape of the mystery. The ocean did not return a full answer, but it did return fragments. And fragments are cruel. They tell you the event was real, the ending was physical, and the aircraft did not simply dissolve into legend. Yet fragments cannot tell you who was in control at the critical moment, what happened in the cockpit, or whether the final descent was planned, chaotic, or something in between. Then we reach the most serious documented conclusion in the case. And this is where the tone must change. Because this is the point where the file stops sounding like a mechanical puzzle and starts sounding like a human one. In 2018, investigators released a 495-page report. Reuters reported that the aircraft's controls were likely deliberately manipulated to take the Boeing 777 off course. That is not a small detail. That is the kind of finding that immediately reshapes how every earlier moment is interpreted. At the same time, the investigators could not determine who was responsible. They did not draw a final conclusion about exactly what happened on board. They stated that a conclusive answer depended on finding the wreckage. That is the tension that makes MH370 so hard to leave behind. The case contains a documented suggestion of deliberate action, but not a documented answer to the most important human question: who did it and why? This is also where many people make the case weaker. By rushing too quickly into dramatic certainty, they decide the entire story in one sentence. They pick one culprit, one motive, one theory, and treat it like the file is closed. But that is not what the evidence gives us. The evidence gives us something narrower and more honest. It tells us that randomness becomes harder to believe. It tells us that a simple explanation becomes less convincing once route changes, satellite traces, debris, and the 2018 report are placed beside one another. What it does not give us is the right to pretend that one unresolved suspicion is the same thing as proof. That distinction matters, especially in a case that has already suffered from years of speculation. So here is the strongest theory I would place at the end of this documentary, and I would label it clearly as a theory. The most disturbing possibility is not a supernatural one, and it does not need to be. The most disturbing possibility is that MH370 was not defeated by mystery alone. It was hidden by a combination of deliberate deviation, vast geography, limited final evidence, and the brutal scale of the southern Indian Ocean. That theory fits the documented trail better than fantasies do. It does not accuse a named person without proof. It does not pretend we know the final minutes with certainty. It simply says this: the evidence points more strongly toward intentional off-course movement than toward a clean, random accident that instantly erased the aircraft from understanding. That is not the same as a solved case. It is something colder. It is a pattern that suggests intention without delivering identity. And that may be why this story has never really released its grip on the public mind. Because the most terrifying version of MH370 is not that a plane disappeared. The most terrifying version is that it may have disappeared in a way modern systems could partially trace, partially reconstruct, and still fail to fully explain. We know enough to feel the shape of what happened. We do not know enough to say the final sentence with confidence. That is a uniquely modern kind of dread, not total ignorance, not full knowledge. A wound made of incomplete certainty. Even now, the file is still not closed. In March 2025, Reuters reported that Malaysia agreed to terms with Ocean Infinity to restart the search in a new 15,000 square kilometer area in the southern Indian Ocean, under a no-find, no-fee deal worth $70 million, if the wreckage is found. In April 2025, Reuters reported that the renewed effort was suspended because of poor weather conditions. Then, on December 3, 2025, Reuters reported that the search would resume on December 30, with Ocean Infinity set to conduct a 55-day intermittent operation in a targeted area said to have the highest probability of locating the aircraft. So even after all these years, MH370 remains an active question, not a finished chapter. And that is the final image I would leave with the audience. Not a conspiracy board, not a sensational claim, not an easy villain. Just a single file that still resists its last conclusion. A passenger jet left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing in March 2014. It never arrived. It changed the search map, left traces and data. It left fragments on distant shores. It generated a report that suggested deliberate manipulation, but could not identify responsibility. And more than a decade later, the ocean is still being asked to give back the missing answer, until the wreckage is found in a way that finally explains the last phase of the flight. MH370 is not a solved mystery. It is a documented trail leading into silence. And the reason people keep returning to it is simple. This is one of the rare cases where the evidence is strong enough to deepen the fear, but still incomplete enough to deny closure. That is why the story endures. That is why it still hurts. And that is why MH370 remains, even now, one of the most unsettling unsolved files of the modern age.